Married, divorced, and single here, it's one family that mingles here.
Conservative and liberal here, we've all got to give a little here.
Big and small here, there's room for us all here.
Doubt and belief here, we all can receive here.
LGBTQ and straight here, there is no hate here.
Woman and man here, everyone can here.
Whatever your race here, for all of us grace here.
In imitation of the ridiculous love Almighty God has for each of us and all of us, let us live in love without labels.
Hi everyone, my name is Jepsen. I am one of the pastors here. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I know these are familiar words to most, if not all of you. This is the 23rd Psalm, one of the most famous of all the Psalms written by David in the Old Testament. David, he is a complex human, and I have a confession to make. I don't like him very much. I started the sermon with this psalm because I'm trying to make amends with him. But for some reason, he's got a little bit of a hold on me. Last week after church, I was standing with Heather Lynn, and Paula and Aaron were within earshot. Heather Lynn, she's so thorough and careful, and she loves this church so much. She really does want to get it right. And so I thought I'd give her a jump start on the preparations for the next week because I'm usually very late. And so I thought I'd tell her who I was thinking about preaching about. And I said, I think I'm going to preach about David next week. In light of our sermon series, I'd like to pull out his obvious feminine and masculine characteristics, and I'd like to examine those. It shouldn't be very hard. Aaron chimed in and said, yeah, really look at that friendship with Jonathan. It was so helpful for me to have him to read about in my coming out process. And Paula, in her thoughtful, noble way, agreed and nodded. That was before I got started. And when I saw Paula and Aaron at our staff meeting on Tuesday, I said, why in the world did you let me do this? This guy is a disaster. To be honest, I should have known that already, and I did. But I wasn't really honest with myself. Sometimes these characters and these stories in Scripture, when we look at them or seek to look at them through the lens of truth, we discover a level of truth that might threaten to unravel our notions of what we thought we knew. Or more importantly, our notions of what we thought we knew about God. And I tell you, and I know some of your stories and how you have wrestled Scripture to the ground, that this is not easy work. I believe it's good work. But it has been a rough week in my house. And not just because of David, but mostly because of God's preference for David. I don't get it. And in these moments, I'm just really glad that I am not God, because that work is way above my pay grade. And I've known for a very long time that David was a disaster. Eric, my partner, a few years back, had his own minor crisis of faith while reading through these tales of conquests and kings. It's a sordid time in Jewish history, and as Christians, it's our history too. Yes, we hinge a lot of things on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and that provides respite somewhat, but it's still part of our story. All of it is part of our story. Eric has begun to dabble in his family's history through Ancestry.com. He has discovered a familial line that dates back to the time in the region of slavery. There is a high probability that his ancestors owned slaves. This is difficult information, and we've discussed the weight of that knowledge and what do we do with that. And it's similar here. Anytime that there is a power differential, when there's oppression and abuse because of power, we have a responsibility. And I read about David and his life, and I admit difficulty in reconciling these truths. Rachel Held Evans, in her book Inspired, Slaying Giants, Walking on Water, and Loving the Bible Again, addressed this concern, not just in David's life, but in the realities that plague much of Israel's violence across the Old Testament. She said, when it comes to processing these troubling stories, there are generally three types of people. One, those who accept without question that God ordered military campaigns in Canaan and has likely supported others throughout history. Two, those who are so troubled by the notion of God condoning ethnic cleansing that it strains their faith or compels them to abandon it. Three, those who can name all of the Kardashian sisters and are probably happier for it. I fit rather decidedly into the second category, the Bible's tales of violence and holy war adding some of the first wrinkles to my pristinely starched faith. Needless to say, while I also would like to claim myself as the second type of person, I wonder if life would just be easier if I could actually name all the Kardashians. But alas, I cannot, so you get to be privy to my messy week. And in light of our sermon series, like I mentioned earlier, I naively thought the subjects of masculinity and femininity would come easy in this person of David. I thought that his traits would be clearly delineated into his assumed feminine traits of musical ability and shepherding, songwriting, and loving well, while his amazing kingly warrior self would naturally segue into a brilliant and rousing conversation around his healthy and, shall we say, not so healthy masculinity. But again, I hit a stumbling block, because we all know there is no line between feminine and masculine within a physical body. It all intertwines, doesn't it? And while many of us, whether by society or family expectations or religious contexts, have had to tamp down our various parts and pieces depending on how they relate to how others perceive us or how we perceive ourselves, it's all a mixed bag. We are all a mixed bag, every single one of us. None of us fit neatly into any camp. This expression of femininity and masculinity, it's all part of a beautiful spectrum. And in our current Western culture, it can look very different than in other cultures. To divide anyone up, whether they dwell here and now or in ancient Israel, is an impossibility and a grave disservice. So I invite you into my processed mess about David. I promise to do my best to make sense today, and like I said, it has been a week. And please know, I am no expert. I'm just doing my very best to see him as he is. But mostly, how I want to see him is how he was designed by a good, generous, and loving God. It's an interesting time in the history of Israel. The Hebrews, they've been delivered from the clutches of Pharaoh's abusive and exploitative power out of Egypt. They wander around at the guidance and direction of Moses and then Joshua before finally entering into the promised land of Canaan. For about 300 years, they were ruled by a series of judges, which included one woman, and now they decided they want to look just like everybody else. They want a king. And so God answered their demands. Saul, the first king anointed by Samuel, who was the acting priest and judge, Saul, he had a tragic reign. He was not well, nor was he happy. And I suspect being the first king of any nation would be terrible work. And Saul is not keeping up his end of the bargain. And Samuel has some strong words for him, prophesying about who Saul's successor will be. And I'm sure this doesn't help Saul's sour mood very much. 1 Samuel 13:13, Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. God, instead of keeping Saul's line going, is switching to a new one, the Davidic line. There's something special about David, and Samuel gets to be the one to discover him. God sends him to a man, Jesse. Jesse has 6 sons who all parade before Samuel. Samuel thinks they're all pretty amazing and are great kingly material, but God doesn't think so. After all 6 are denied, Samuel asks Jesse, "Is this it? Are these all of your boys?" Jesse responds with, "Well, the youngest, he's out tending the sheep." 1 Samuel 16:11, and Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, had beautiful eyes, and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. There's something about David. He's got this sun-kissed look, fresh from the fields. When he grows up, he's going to be like on the cover of one of those romance novels that I snuck in front of my parents. David's got it all, and apparently he has the heart to go with it. Ancient Hebrew writings posit that God chose David because of David's remarkable talent in caring for sheep. God tested David and found him to be a very good shepherd. David had a strategy for feeding his flock. Depending upon the age of the lamb or of the sheep, he would lead them to various places to graze, depending on what their bodies needed at different stages of development. According to this teaching, God figured that if David could love his sheep so well, he could also love the people of Israel so well. Psalm 78:70 says, "He chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought him to be shepherd of this people Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart. With skillful hands he led them." David was exceptional. And my heart is soft to this David because I see him like me. I see him as nurturing and capable and creative. I see how God could describe him as a man after God's heart. I see femininity. I see care and generosity, kindness and compassion. I see the good shepherd of Psalm 23, and I think, yeah, I like that guy. I see a young man who appeals to my mothering senses, who appeals to my own need to provide shepherding and care, who echoes my own call as a woman, as a mother, as a pastor. And just because these may be feminine characteristics, it's not just women that get to administer these gifts. In fact, the men that I gravitate to share these same qualities. I trust David here. I trust God here. I can see how God could choose someone like this to lead the people of Israel. I trust in God's assessment of David. Psychology Today recently reported on an analysis conducted by psychologist Y. Joel Wong. Dr. Wong identified 4 traditionally masculine characteristics: emotional control, sexual promiscuity, power over women, and self-reliance. And in a meta-analysis of 74 studies with over 19,000 men, these traditionally masculine characteristics were associated with poorer mental health, which manifested in depression, distress, and low self-esteem. Dr. Wong determined that these masculine characteristics may be a problem in the relationships that men have with others, ultimately contributing to poorer mental health. Can we all say, duh? And on the flip side, in a 17-year study of 700 men who adopted the feminine characteristics of sensitivity to the needs of others, affection, loving children, and gentleness, these men were found to have much lower rates of death from coronary artery disease. Again, duh. So according to this meta-analysis, and what I think we might say we know intuitively, Healthy masculinity involves a hefty dose of femininity. And this is what I see in David here. And this is what I think God sees in David. This is how David is designed. This is who David is. And despite his rising star and his victories and his early collection of wives, I sense a humility and a sensitivity. And this is evident most of all in his friendship with Jonathan. Things with King Saul really are not going well. Saul is clinging to power, knowing that David is growing in popularity, and David is beloved. And the one who loves David the most is Saul's son, Jonathan. 1 Samuel 18:1. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Verse 3, then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. Jonathan not only declares his devotion to David as a friend and as a companion, Jonathan loves David as he loves himself. He is devoted to David in every way, including possibly handing over his own right to the throne to David. And as King Saul continues his murderous rage against David while also placing David in positions of authority, Jonathan defends him constantly without interruption. The devotion between David and Jonathan gives us another glimpse of David's softness and his tenderness. And despite his growing power amongst the Israelites, he remains dedicated and devoted to his dear friend. As David runs from Saul, Jonathan defends him time and time again, and David is provided with opportunity after opportunity to kill Saul, but instead chooses to forgive him and spare his life instead. As David amasses more wives and more victories and great power, he eventually is anointed king of all Israel. We can now start to imagine what this might do to a person's ability to remain humble. And I'm not sure if humility was even a goal for David or if he adored the clamor, but I have to believe, because we see it all around us in our own patriarchal society, that what happens to a young man's psyche with unlimited power, or an old man's for that matter, unlimited power and adoration, it does not end up well. Saul is now dead. David's anointing is complete. David now is powerful. He now has power over. And while I still believe that he is a man after God's own heart, I suspect he gets lost. He is not impervious to these effects of power. And after loads and loads of victories, King David finally experiences defeat, but it is not in the battlefield. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. He stayed home. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent word and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." David raped Bathsheba. He could, so he did. She had no power. He only had power over her. He wanted her, and he took her. Typically in wartime, the king would be on the field with his men. But for some reason, David did not go this time, and maybe he was a little bored, maybe he was feeling insecure, maybe he was disappointed in himself. But he saw her, and he had to have her, and he did. She got pregnant by him, and now David is stuck. He's up against a wall. Interestingly, David's masculinity is now called into question. Men who are at war in this time typically withhold from sex. So for him to first be home and not on the battlefield and also engaging in sex, both of these challenge his masculinity. And then contrast his actions with Uriah, who is not only unwilling to succumb to the king's trap, he is loyal to the king and to his people. Uriah is the ultimate in masculinity. His loyalty, his dedication, his determination, his integrity are the ideal, and David falls desperately short. After this, David has Joab place Uriah on the front lines of battle, and Uriah is killed. David takes Bathsheba as his 8th wife, and another sermon that I will have to save for 10 years from now when this finally washed out of my system is, what in the world did Bathsheba think about all of this? I suspect she had no choice in the matter. What we now witness in David is a toxic masculinity. Before his kingship, David wasn't so enmeshed in power. He was fighting for his life. He was running from King Saul, fighting for Saul on the battlefield. And now David is in the driver's seat. He holds all the power, and he seems to have forgotten what he was once, how he was designed, a man after God's own heart. When masculinity enmeshes with power, we have a masculinity that can become toxic. We are surrounded today in the news and in our lives and in our communities with the ramifications of this toxic masculinity. We have a rise of white supremacist violence. We have a rise of domestic violence as men believe that masculinity is really about violence and the appearance of hardness and suppression of emotions. And we know that healthy masculinity is an inclusion of the feminine, a celebration of the feminine. Determining the feminine and the masculine in a body, in a life, in a society is very difficult work. And in this context of King David, we have a flawed human, as we all are. But what we also witness is a man who can then be humbled. We witness a man who is brought low because he is a man after God's heart. And in his life, what looks feminine in that day and place and time, those were actually masculine characteristics. His shepherding, his musical talent, his songwriting skills, his love for his friend were all accepted as perfectly masculine in that day. This expression of David was actually masculinity at its finest. His way of worshiping God, of providing for others, of expressing himself were all masculine. As a mother of sons, I am attuned to what the world says my boys should be like. I'm grateful they have a model in their father of what healthy masculinity is, but I know they are bombarded each day with what they believe they're supposed to be according to the world's standards. And I grieve this as their mother. I want them to be confident in how they are designed, also men after God's heart. But I know the pressure is real. And I pray all of us, however we identify, can live the lives that we are designed to live, made in the image of God who knows every hair on our head, every tooth in our mouth, every urge, every desire, and none of this is shameful. All of it is beautiful, and it is ordained. David still and forever will be a conundrum to me, but I think I might like him a little bit more. His lineage has given us Jesus, the ultimate in healthy masculinity, one who embraced and honored the feminine and masculine perfectly intertwined. And I do need to redeem David a little. My work still is not done, but I do know and I do believe that he was a man after God's heart. Because no one could pen the words he penned without a slight dose, or maybe a hefty dose, of healthy masculinity. This is how David was designed, how we are all designed, loved. Men, women, gender non-binary, after God's own heart. Psalm 139. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be.
Thanks again for watching today's sermon at Left Hand Church. If you live in Colorado and would like to attend, we meet on Saturdays at 5 o'clock. If you'd like to contribute to Left Hand Church, go to lefthandchurch.org/give. And if you'd like to send us a confidential prayer request, you can send it to prayer@lefthandchurch.org. Thanks again for watching.